The rain was lashing down against the cracked pavement, matching the tears streaming down Elena's face. In her hand she held her last £5, the only thing standing between her and a night without a meal. She had just been humiliated in a job interview, told she was worthless, and felt the weight of the world crushing her spirit. But then she saw him, a man huddled in a damp corner, shivering, his eyes reflecting a hollow hunger she knew all too well. What Elena didn't know was that by reaching out her hand, she wasn't just helping a beggar. She was stepping into a trap set by a man who owned half the city. Would her final act of desperation lead to her ruin? Or was the miracle she prayed for standing right in front of her? The morning had started with a flicker of hope, the kind of fragile light that usually precedes a storm. Elena stood before her cracked bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of her only professional blouse. It was frayed at the edges, much like her nerves, but she tucked the loose threads away with a determined sigh. For 6 months, she had walked the streets of the city, submitting resumes that seemed to vanish into a void. Her savings had dwindled from a modest safety net to a handful of coins and a single £5 note. Today was different, she told herself. Today was the interview at Sterling Global, a firm so prestigious that even being invited to the lobby felt like a victory. She lived in a cramped, damp flat where the heater groaned but never quite produced warmth, and her landlord had already slipped a final notice under her door. This job wasn't just a career move, it was her survival. As she stepped outside, the London sky was a bruised purple, threatening a downpour. She walked quickly to save the bus fare, her shoes clicking rhythmically on the pavement. Her stomach gave a sharp, painful twist, reminding her that she had skipped dinner the night before to ensure she looked presentable today. She tried to focus on her strengths, reciting her qualifications in her head, but the hunger made her lightheaded. By the time she reached the towering glass monolith of Sterling Global, she was shivering. The lobby was a temple of marble and hushed whispers. People in tailored suits moved with a purpose she envied, their lives seemingly untouched by the grit of the world outside. Elena felt like an intruder, a gray smudge on a pristine canvas. The interview was a disaster from the moment she entered the room. The hiring manager, a man named Mr. Thorne, didn't even look up from his tablet as she sat down. He spent 10 minutes dismantling her resume with a cold, surgical precision. He mocked her lack of high-level experience and questioned why someone from her background thought they could fit into a culture of excellence. Elena tried to defend her work ethic, her passion, and her willingness to learn. But Thorne cut her off with a flick of his wrist. He told her she was a waste of his time and suggested she look for work in a kitchen rather than a boardroom. The cruelty in his voice was unnecessary, a deliberate attempt to make himself feel powerful by making her feel small. She left the office with her head bowed, the stinging heat of humiliation rising in her chest. When she stepped back onto the street, the clouds finally broke. The rain came down in a deluge, soaking through her thin blouse and ruining her hair. She stood under a bus shelter, watching the affluent commuters rush past, shielding themselves with expensive umbrellas. She felt invisible. The £5 note in her pocket felt heavy, a reminder of her impending failure. She began to walk toward her flat, the cold water seeping into her shoes. She passed an alleyway where the wind whistled through discarded boxes, and there she saw him. He was an elderly man, wrapped in a threadbare blanket that offered no protection against the damp. He wasn't begging out loud. He was simply sitting there, his head bowed, looking at the ground with a quiet, dignified sorrow. Elena stopped. She thought about her empty fridge and her looming eviction. She thought about the cruelty of Mr. Thorne and the indifference of the city. Then, she looked at the man's hands. They were blue from the cold, trembling as he tried to pull the wet blanket closer. A wave of empathy washed over her, sharper than her own hunger. She knew what it was to be forgotten. Slowly, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the £5 note. It was her dinner. It was her bus fare for tomorrow's search. It was everything she had left. She walked over to the man and gently placed the money in his lap. He looked up, his eyes a startling, clear blue amidst a face lined with years of hardship. Elena didn't say a word. She just gave him a small, sad smile and walked away into the rain. Her stomach empty, but her heart momentarily lightened by a strange sense of peace. The walk home felt longer than usual, without the £5 note. Elena knew she would be drinking tap water for dinner and walking 5 miles the next morning to hand out the few paper copies of her resume she had left. Her apartment felt colder than the street. She sat on the edge of her bed, watching the rain streak down the window pane. The silence was deafening. She wondered if she had been a fool. In a world that had shown her nothing but hardness, she had given away her last shred of security to a stranger who might not even remember her face. Yet as she lay down to sleep, she didn't regret it. There was a dignity in that man's eyes that stayed with her, a reminder that even at rock bottom, one could still choose to be kind. The next morning, Elena was woken up by a loud, insistent knocking on her door. Her heart leaped into her throat. Was it the landlord coming to throw her out? She scrambled to the door, her hair disheveled, and pulled it open. Standing there was a man in a sharp black suit holding a leather briefcase. He looked vastly out of place in the dingy hallway. He asked if she was Elena Vance, and when she nodded, he handed her an envelope. Inside was an invitation to a second interview. Not at Sterling Global, but at a firm called Obsidian Holdings, the parent company that owned nearly everything in the district. There was no explanation, only a time and an address. Confused and desperate, Elena spent 2 hours scrubbing her only suit and walking the distance to the new office. Obsidian Holdings was even more intimidating than the previous firm. The building was a fortress of steel and obsidian glass, standing at the very heart of the financial district. When she arrived, she was ushered past the queue of waiting candidates and taken directly to the top floor. The elevator ride felt like an ascent to another world. When the doors opened, she was greeted by a secretary who spoke in hushed, respectful tones. Elena was led into a massive corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire city. Behind a desk of polished mahogany sat a man with his back to her. He was looking out at the rain, which had returned to gray the city once more. The man turned around and Elena's breath caught in her throat. He was young, perhaps in his mid-30s, with sharp features and a commanding presence. But it was his eyes that stopped her heart. They were the same startling, clear blue eyes she had seen in the alleyway the night before. He wasn't wearing a threadbare blanket now. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than her entire apartment building. This was Arthur Sterling, the reclusive billionaire and CEO of Obsidian Holdings. He didn't say anything at first. He just watched her with a steady, unreadable gaze. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Elena felt the urge to run, certain that this was some kind of elaborate, cruel joke. Arthur finally spoke, his voice deep and resonant. He asked her why she had given her last bit of money to a beggar in the rain. Elena was stunned. She stammered, trying to find the words. She told him that she saw someone who had less than she did, and she couldn't walk past without helping. She explained that she knew the feeling of being invisible, and didn't want him to feel that way for one more night. Arthur listened intently, his expression softening just a fraction. He told her that he frequently went out into the streets in disguise to see the true face of the city, to see who was greedy, who was indifferent, and who was genuinely kind. He told her that hundreds of people had passed him that night, many of them his own employees, but she was the only one who stopped. The tension in the room shifted. It wasn't an interview anymore. It was a revelation. Arthur explained that he was looking for a new head of philanthropy, someone who understood the value of a pound and the weight of a human life. He needed someone who hadn't been hardened by the corporate world, someone who still had a heart. But just as he was about to offer her the position, the door burst open. It was Mr. Thorne from Sterling Global. He looked frantic, holding a stack of papers. He began to speak before he noticed. Elena, he told Arthur, that there had been a mistake in the hiring process and that he had found a much better candidate than the lowlife he had seen earlier. He pointed a shaking finger at Elena, his face contorting in disgust, unaware that he was sealing his own fate. The atmosphere in the office turned icy. Mr. Thorne, oblivious to the connection between Arthur and Elena, continued his tirade. He laughed nervously, telling Arthur that Elena was a charity case who had wandered into his office the day before, looking for a handout. He claimed she lacked the breeding and the intelligence to work for a Sterling company. Arthur remained perfectly still, his blue eyes narrowing into slits of cold steel. He stood up slowly, the movement possessed of a predatory grace. He walked around his desk, passing Elena without a word, and stood directly in front of Thorne. The height difference was intimidating, but the moral gap between them was an abyss. Arthur asked Thorne to repeat what he had just said. Thorne, sensing something was wrong but too arrogant to pivot, doubled down. He said that people like Elena were a drain on the system, and that hiring her would be a PR nightmare for the firm. He boasted about how he had put her in her place to protect the company's image. Arthur let out a short, mirthless laugh. He asked Thorne if he remembered seeing an old man in the rain near the office entrance the previous evening. Thorne scoffed, saying he didn't have time to notice the human trash on the sidewalks. At that moment, Arthur reached into his desk and pulled out a small, wet 5-pound note, the very one Elena had given him. The color drained from Thorne's face. He looked from the money to Arthur, then to Elena, his mouth hanging open like a landed fish. Arthur explained that he was that human trash in the alleyway. He told Thorne that while he was busy protecting the company's image, he was actually failing the most basic test of human character. Arthur's voice was low, but it carried the weight of a gavel hitting a block. He told Thorne that the strength of Obsidian Holdings wasn't built on cold ledgers and arrogance, but on the vision of people who could see the world as it truly was. He then informed Thorne that his services were no longer required, and that he was fired, effective immediately, with no severance and a black mark on his record that would ensure he never worked in the city again. Thorne began to plead, his arrogance vanishing in an instant, replaced by a pathetic whining desperation. He tried to apologize to Elena, but Arthur cut him off, calling for security. As Thorne was dragged out of the office, protesting and crying, a heavy silence returned to the room. Elena stood there, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt a mix of shock, vindication, and an overwhelming sense of vertigo. The world had flipped upside down in less than 24 hours. She looked at Arthur, who was now smoothing the 5-pound note out on his desk with a strange, reverent care. He looked up at her, and for the first time he gave her a genuine warm smile. He told her that the position was hers if she wanted it. The salary was more money than Elena had ever dreamed of, enough to pay off her debts, move into a beautiful home, and never worry about a meal again. But more than the money, he offered her the power to change things. He wanted her to lead a foundation that would find people just like her, people with talent and heart who had been discarded by the world, and give them a chance to shine. Elena felt tears pricking her eyes. She asked him why he was doing all this for her. Arthur stepped closer, his gaze intense. He told her that her 5 pounds hadn't just bought him a meal. It had bought him a reason to believe that the city still had a soul. However, the transition wasn't going to be as simple as signing a contract. Arthur warned her that the board of directors would be skeptical. They were men and women who thought like Thorne, people who valued pedigree over personality. He told her that she would have to prove herself in a way few ever had to. He was going to put her in charge of a failing community project in the roughest part of the city. If she could turn it around in 30 days, her position would be permanent. Elena looked at the challenge and felt a surge of adrenaline. She had spent her whole life surviving. Now she was being asked to build. She took Arthur's hand and shook it, her grip firm. The bargain was struck, but as she turned to leave, she noticed a look in Arthur's eyes that wasn't just professional. It was a spark of something much deeper, a connection forged in the rain and the cold. The next 30 days were a whirlwind of exhaustion and triumph. Elena was assigned to the Haven, a dilapidated youth center that the board wanted to shut down and sell to developers for a luxury apartment complex. The building was crumbling. The staff hadn't been paid in weeks, and the local community had lost all faith in the institution. Elena didn't show up in a limousine. She arrived in her old clothes, rolled up her sleeves, and started by cleaning the floors herself. She spent her first week listening. She listened to the teenagers who had nowhere else to go, the mothers who feared for their children's futures, and the elderly who remembered when the center was the heart of the neighborhood. She used the initial budget Arthur provided not for vanity projects, but for the basics: heat, food, and books. She reached out to local businesses, not asking for handouts, but offering partnerships. Her sincerity was infectious. People who had long since given up on the system found themselves drawn to her energy. Elena worked 18-hour days, often sleeping on a cot in the back office. She was no longer just a jobless girl. She was a leader. Arthur visited frequently, though he never announced his arrival. He would stand in the shadows, watching her mediate disputes, teach a child to read, or negotiate with a local contractor. He saw the way she looked at people, with the same empathy she had shown him in the alleyway. As the deadline approached, the transformation of the Haven was nothing short of miraculous. The walls were vibrant with murals painted by local kids. The kitchen was serving hot meals daily, and a job training program had already placed 5 residents into steady work. However, the board of directors remained cold. They saw the social value as a distraction from the real estate value. On the day of the final presentation, Elena stood in the same boardroom where she had once felt like an interloper. This time she wasn't wearing a frayed blouse. She was wearing a suit Arthur had sent her, but her eyes held a fire that no clothing could provide. She didn't talk about profit margins. She talked about lives saved. She showed them photos of the children at the Haven. She told the story of a young man who had been on the verge of joining a gang but was now apprenticing as an electrician. She spoke with a conviction that silenced the room. When she finished, the board members looked at each other, murmuring. One of the oldest members, a man known for his ruthlessness, asked her how she expected to make the center self-sustaining. Elena presented a detailed plan for a social enterprise model, a cafe and a community garden that would generate enough revenue to cover the center's costs. She had done the math and it was flawless. The board was forced to admit that she hadn't just saved a building, she had created a blueprint for sustainable philanthropy. Arthur stood up at the end of the meeting. He announced that he was personally matching every pound the center made, effectively doubling its budget. He then turned to the board and informed them that Elena Vance was no longer a candidate for the head of philanthropy. She was the new director, with full autonomy over the Sterling Foundation's billion-pound endowment. The room erupted in a mix of stunned silence and reluctant applause. Elena felt a wave of relief so strong she had to lean against the table. She had done it. She had secured her future, and the future of hundreds of others. But as the board members filed out, Arthur remained. He walked over to her, his expression uncharacteristically soft. He told her he was proud of her, but his voice held a weight that suggested he wanted to say more. He took her hand, and this time he didn't let go. He confessed that the night he sat in that alleyway, he had been at his lowest point emotionally, mourning the death of his father and feeling completely disconnected from his wealth. He told her that her simple act of kindness had saved his life as much as it had changed hers. He invited her to dinner, not as an employee but as an equal. As they walked out of the building together, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the city that had once seemed so gray and cruel. Elena realized that her 5 pounds hadn't just been a gift. It had been an investment in a future she never thought possible. Life changed for Elena in ways she could barely process. Within months, she moved into a beautiful apartment overlooking the Thames, but she never forgot the damp flat she had left behind. She kept her old, frayed blouse in the back of her wardrobe as a reminder of where she had come from. Her work at the Sterling Foundation became a beacon of hope throughout the country. She didn't just sit in an office signing checks. She was on the ground in the trenches, ensuring that every penny went toward giving people a genuine second chance. She became a public figure, known for her radical empathy and her refusal to play the corporate games that had once nearly destroyed her. Her relationship with Arthur blossomed into a deep, soul-stirring romance. They were a formidable pair, the billionaire who had seen the bottom and the girl who had risen from it. Arthur taught her the complexities of global finance, and in return, Elena taught him how to see the humanity behind the numbers. They spent their evenings walking through the city, often stopping at the very alleyway where they had first met. It became a sacred space for them, a reminder that the smallest actions can have the greatest consequences. Arthur eventually proposed to her there, under the same London sky, and Elena said yes with a heart full of joy. Their wedding was not a cold, aristocratic affair. It was a celebration that included the staff, from the Haven and the people Elena had helped along the way. The man who had once been Mr. Thorne found himself on the other side of the desk many times, but his reputation preceded him. No one would hire a man who had been publicly shamed by Arthur Sterling for his lack of character. He eventually left the city, a bitter reminder of what happens when one chooses cruelty over compassion. Elena, however, chose to forgive him in her heart, though she never reached out. She knew that his punishment was living with the person he had become. She focused her energy on the thousands of people who were still waiting for their 5-pound miracle, creating programs that reached into the darkest corners of the country. 1 year after their first meeting, Elena organized a massive gala for the foundation. The guest list included the most powerful people in the world, but the guest of honor was a man she had found living in a shelter, a former teacher who had lost everything to medical debt. She gave him the same 5-pound note that Arthur had framed and kept in his office, telling him it was a loan that he could repay by helping someone else one day. The story of the jobless girl and the billionaire beggar became a modern legend, a fairy tale rooted in the gritty reality of the streets. It inspired a new wave of corporate responsibility, making people realize that the greatest asset any company has is the character of its people. As Elena stood on the balcony of the gala, looking out at the city lights, Arthur joined her, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. She leaned into him, feeling the warmth and the security she had once thought was a myth. She thought back to that rainy day, the hunger in her stomach and the despair in her soul. She realized that her life hadn't changed because of luck, but because of a choice. She had chosen to give when she had nothing, and in return, the universe had given her everything. The lesson was simple but profound. Kindness is never a waste, and a single act of generosity can create a ripple that changes the world forever. The story of Elena and Arthur reminds us all that we never truly know the impact we have on others. A small gesture, a moment of recognition, or a handful of coins can be the bridge that leads someone out of the darkness. In a world that often values power and wealth above all else, the true billionaires are those who are rich in spirit and generous in heart. Elena Vance started the day as a jobless girl with no future, but she ended it as the architect of a new destiny, all because she was brave enough to care for a stranger in the rain. Generosity is a seed that, once planted, grows into a forest of blessings. Elena's story isn't just about a financial reward. It's about the power of the human spirit to remain kind even in the face of hardship. When you see someone struggling, remember that your compassion might be the very thing that saves them, and in a twist of fate, it might be the thing that saves you too. Never look down on someone unless you are reaching down to help them up. If this story touched your heart, remember to carry that light into your own life. You never know who is watching, or how one small act of kindness might change your world forever.